We're in the book of Romans tonight, chapter 7. Look at a couple of other verses, but that's our golden text tonight, number 18 of chapter 7. Romans chapter 7, verse 18. Hopefully answering a question, pleasant, present, or nasty now. And then on the Lord's Day, another question, what are we waiting for? Hope these messages are going to be helpful for all of us. Really do pray and seek God about it. So trust that He's using these words to help someone. Don't know what version you have. I'm reading from the King James, chapter 7, verse 18 of the book of Romans. This is the Apostle Paul, of course. And in verse 18 he writes, "For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, there dwelleth not good. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good, I'm not finding." This message really was born because of something Solomon told me. I don't know how it came to him, but just recently he said it dawned on him, or he was reminded that God is an optimist. And I had never thought of that, but I thought, yeah, that's true. And he said, when I thought about that, God's an optimist, I'll be an optimist too. And I thought there's a lot of truth there, and it got me thinking about this concept of how we live our everyday lives, not just long term, but day after day, week after week. And it occurred to me that we have a choice regarding how our everyday life works. And it really came clear to me, and I'll mention it in just a minute or two, when I had another car experience that I didn't enjoy on one of our back streets when I was on my way to the office on the morning. I think it was Monday. But we'll save that for just a tick. Let's look at the nasty now first, and then we'll move on to, hopefully, the pleasant present. Who's talking here? I would call him our spiritual everyman, the Apostle Paul. His given name was Saul or Savlos, and his Roman name was Pavlos. So Savlos became Pavlos. And he's our everyman. And what he's doing, very brave of him, and I'm sure he was inspired by the Spirit of God to do it, he kind of just opens his heart to us. He's really sharing the kind of thing that you'd only tell your wife or girlfriend or husband or whatever. You wouldn't just kind of share this information willy-nilly. Now think about him. He's sharing it not just with his immediate audience, but 2,000 years later with all the Bibles that have been printed and sold and given away. He is still letting people know what's going on in his innermost being. And here's the interesting part to me, and hopefully to you. His is not too different to ours. The way he's working is not too different to the way you and I work on a day-to-day basis, especially when it comes to whether we're going to be a down-in-the-mouth or an optimist person. Here's my paraphrase of what we just read, Romans 7, verse 18. "For I have come to the settled conclusion that there dwells not in me," and then he used this beautiful word, to testin, which is a strong demonstrative pronoun. "For I know I've come to the settled conclusion that there dwells not in me, that is, in my flesh, good." Now, how did he know that? How did he know that there was nothing good in his flesh, in his fallen nature? Here it is. "For the to will is present with me, but the how to work out the good I'm not finding." And just the way he wrote it, the picture is he was looking. And I think we need to remind ourselves of who we're talking about and who's talking to us. This is not just some rum-dum that, fell off a turnip truck or is sleeping under a bridge someplace. This guy was extremely well educated. His native language, from at least Tony Beerenhouse and others believe, which I agree, his native language was Koine Greek, and then being a Jew, of course, he spoke Aramaic. But in addition, he had been trained by rabbis, and so he actually spoke, read, and taught Hebrew, which was very unusual for a Jewish person in the time of Christ. So we're not talking about somebody that, just came into town. This is somebody that really knows what's going on. And the other thing is, the way he says, to will's present, but how to work it out, He was searching. He was really looking for a better life. I personally think he had really had it up to here with the nasty now. He wanted a different lifestyle. He wanted a different day-to-day like most of us. So here is the spiritual inner nasty now. And Paul is actually describing what he said in another connection that time to the church at Corinth. If you have your Bible, I can just read it to you. 1 Corinthians now, we're in Romans for our text, but 1 Corinthians 2:12, he says something very similar, and it helps us understand what he's on about here. He's asking the question in 1 Corinthians 2:12, for whom among humanity stands knowledgeable of the things of the man, except the spirit of the man, the one which is in him. I think if that's all we heard tonight, it'd probably be enough to make our getting together worthwhile. Because this is great news from a great Christian mystic regarding how you and I, and really every human being, work, spiritually speaking. He's basically saying you and I have an inner knower. We also have an inner feeler. What I mean by that is we are not our thoughts, but we can know our thoughts. We are not our emotions, but we can know our emotions. We can observe them. Very, very deep, very subtle, but very, very important, especially if you and I are really serious about becoming optimistic like our Heavenly Father and switching from every day being a lousy, nasty now to a pleasant present. We're not our thoughts, we have thoughts. We are not our emotions, we have emotions. And think about this, beloved. These things can change with the wind. I'll never forget one minister I heard give this example, and I thought it was really beautiful. There was a lady that was severely depressed, and her friends didn't know what to do about it. They would try to visit, they would recommend different things and vitamins and take her to dinner and this, that, and the other. But she was just down in the mouth, just really always depressed. And on one particular Saturday morning, I think it was, she got a phone call from another friend she hadn't seen for quite a while. And the friend didn't really know the state that she was in, didn't realize about the depression and all that. Said, hey, I just want to let you know, do you remember that winter coat that you were really anxious to get, but it was too expensive at Macy's? Yeah. Just wanted to let you know it's on sale for 50% off. What? Are you going there now? Well, I was thinking about going in a few minutes. Why? Just give me time to get dressed. And could you pick me up? And suddenly all that depression and all that down was gone because she got some new information. She was no longer thinking about her problems. She was thinking about a coat that she had been salivating after like a Labrador dog. Now that illustrates what we're talking about. We really can change the way we experience life, but we have to become aware of it. We have to separate from knee-jerk reactions to what life tosses us and begin to respond rather than react. If we react, the circumstance or the person or the situation is in charge. If we respond, we, under God, are in charge, and it makes all the difference in the world. So let's go back now to where we were in Romans. Our old fallen nature, which Paul describes as the flesh, is a stranger to positivity of any stripe or type. Our natural fallenness does not know anything about positive feelings, good feelings, happy feelings. Now think about this. Apparently, after some bit of time, and I would say detailed observation of himself, Paul arrived at this settled conclusion, and at this point, in my judgment, he was an unsaved believer. Was he Jewish by background? Yes. Was he trained by one of the best rabbis of the day? Yes. Was he trilingual, or possibly did he speak 4 languages, even some Latin? I would say yes. And yet, with all of this going for him, think about it, He finds himself a failure, and basically, he's very much like anyone else who's part and parcel of lost humanity, regardless of his belief system, his training, his background, or his knowledge. And it's very sad. I'll just pause here for a minute, because some people read Romans 7. They say, well, one thing about it, that's really our life, isn't it? And bless God, we'll never get over this, and we'll never get out of it. And, the flesh is the flesh is the flesh, and we're just kind of doomed to barely make it, Not really. Well, why is that, Pastor? Because I do not understand the text to say that Paul is saved here. There are a lot of believers, ministers, that believe he's talking as an unsaved person. As a saved person in the present. That as, not Savlos, but Pavlos, as Paul, the new believer, he's still got this flesh. He wants to do good, but can't, etc., etc. Now, why do you think he wasn't, Pastor? Primarily verse 14 of this same chapter, Romans 7, verse 14. There he talks about Jesus doing for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. And he says, the law is spiritual, but I'm carnal, sold under bondage to sin. And he goes on to talk about the fact that he is sold into bondage in sin, verse 14. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. And actually, the verb he uses there is perfect tense, meaning at a time in my life in the past, I was sold under the power of sin, with the result that I've remained there. I'm still in bondage to sin. I still belong to sin. Now, that is not true of any believer. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us. Paul actually says that Jesus gave us the way out of this. And so no believer would testify what Paul is testifying here. In me, I'm sold under bondage to sin permanently. That's just simply not true of every believer. So I believe he's speaking in the historical present, talking about his past life as though it's happening now, as a dedicated yet still unsaved Jewish rabbi looking to please God. Now, in the very next verse, he gives us another description of the lot of lost humanity. Now I'm moving to Romans, the book of Romans, for a little bit of additional information. We've been in Romans chapter 7. I want to go to Romans chapter 8. There Paul says in verse 13, for assuming you are living according to the flesh, which Paul had been doing as an unsaved but zealous would-be believer, for assuming you are living according to the flesh, you are about to die. The word die there means obviously twice, physically and then eternally. But assuming by means of the Spirit you are putting to death the practices of the body, you are about to live. Again, twice. A new body and also forever. And I lived this experience, as I mentioned, just a few days ago. I'm making my way to church. I take these back streets because that's just something I like to do. There's not a lot of traffic. And just making my way to the church through the back way. And I come up the road. There's my stop sign. There's also a stop sign to the left for people coming in that direction. In front of me, which I mentioned last week, there's another little place, and it just simply says no outlet, so there's nowhere to go. And then there's another stop sign on the right for people coming that way. So here I am tooling up in my car. I'm not quite at the stop sign. And who's coming to my left? Huge truck. It looked like it was bigger than New York. Here comes this truck, boom, just rolling up. And I thought, oh my, so I'm ready to jump on the brakes. I'm approaching the stop sign, but I'm ready to really protect myself because man, he's just boom. And it was as though he looked over at me, and suddenly he did not blast through the stop sign. He got the front of his cab over the line, and you could see that he was jumping on the brakes, and the whole truck shook. And I'm thinking, wow, now, what do you think happened inside here? Probably the same thing that would have happened to you. When I saw him doing that, I had some unpleasant thoughts toward him and toward his driving and toward his truck. That's what I felt. That's what I thought. There was anything but the peace of God presiding in my inner man at that moment. He stops, the truck's shaking. I see him actually look over at me from his window, and he goes like this, and he goes like this, like, go ahead through, smiling. And I thought, bless your heart. So I made my right turn, went, and he followed me with a nice space behind me. And how did you feel then, Pastor? Totally different. I would not have told him the things I was thinking about telling him just a minute before. What happened? Something happened in his life and his approach, and something happened in here. Suddenly, I was thinking different thoughts and feeling different feelings. How's that work, Pastor? Well, we are not our thoughts, we have thoughts. We are not our emotions, we have emotions. And so I stopped, looked, and listened, and think about it. I moved really from what was the nasty now to, I would say, the pleasant present. And I just went on my merry way and got to church and then forgot all about it until I was thinking about this message. And I thought, boy, do I have an illustration from my real life. I live this thing. Shame on me, you know. But I don't think I'm too different to you guys. So let's try to move, if we can, from the nasty now to the pleasant present. How's that work? Well, what occurred to me to describe it, and I don't believe in giving free advice. I'm trying to live this thing every day of my life because it's no fun living the other way. I'm trying to kind of move into pleasant Presentville, you know, and kind of say goodbye to nasty now. But I think at this juncture, something that people in the house selling business do, real estate people, they've got a mantra. Maybe you've heard it. What's important when you're trying to sell a house or buy a house? Anybody know what it is? Thanks, Mark. Location, location, location. Now, when it comes to moving residents from the nasty now to the pleasant present, it's the same thing. It's much the same thing. It's switching from the nasty now to the pleasant present by changing our approach and our attitude. And I found this very helpful. There are examples of this concept all throughout the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament alike. It's very encouraging. It comes down basically to changing our focus. Go back to the depressed woman. She's thinking about and observing and ruminating about all that's wrong in her life. She gets a phone call about a beautiful coat she wanted but couldn't afford that she can now suddenly afford. And she's the same person, but she's thinking in a different way. She's no longer ruminating over what's wrong in her life. She's changed her focus to the coat she couldn't have but now can. So another way of saying it is, this whole concept really has to do more with what's going on in us rather than what's happening to us. You might say, well, they're both the same. They're not really. It's subtle, but there's a difference. You can have something going on outside, and you can get over it if it's not going on inside. Here we go again with the Apostle Paul. Again in Romans 8, rather than 7, which was our beginning text. Look at Romans 8, verse 4. How is it that you and I get to choose as human persons where we're going to live and experience life on a daily basis, in the nasty now or the pleasant present? How is it that we get a choice? Romans 8:4. It talks to us basically about what Jesus did for us. In verse 3, for what the law could not do, in that it was weak through our flesh, God sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin condemned sin in the flesh. And here is the result. In order that the requirement of the law, which is, of course, love of God, love of ourselves, love of others, should be fulfilled in us, the ones not continually walking according to the flesh, but rather according to the Spirit. Why is that, Paul? For the ones continually being according to the flesh, the things of the flesh are what? Minding. So there it is again. 1 Corinthians. Who among men knows the thoughts of the man, but the spirit of the man that is in him? The ones continually walking according to the flesh, but rather according to the Spirit. For the ones continually being according to the flesh, the things of the flesh are minding, and the ones according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. How do you and I know which is which? How do we know whether we're in nasty Nowville or pleasant Presentville? For the mind of the flesh, death, but the mind of the Spirit, life and peace. That's Romans 8:5. Now, I like that verse. I mentioned, I think it was last week in another connection, there's a little word in the language of the New Testament, looks like K-A-I, kappa, alpha, iota, and it means and, it means also, but it can also mean even, for emphasis type thing, or describing the same thing in a different way, depending on the context. I think we can read it that way without harming the text at all. For the mind of the flesh, the unsaved person, death, but the mind of the Spirit, life, even peace, Romans 8:5. So there is a little bell from upstairs. One way you and I can find out quickly where we are, nasty now, pleasant present. What's happening down here? Not here, down here. Why are so many people so angry about so many things? Because they're living out of their head. Someone says something to them, they reply back before they even think about it. They live up here. Whereas according to the Scripture, our real life is down here. As Jesus said, out of our belly can flow rivers of living water. So the spiritual man is here. The natural, carnal mind is here. And the difference between the two, day and night. How do we tell which one we're in? Here it is, Romans, again, chapter 8. But you are not in the flesh, but rather in the Spirit. How do I know that, Paul? Assuming God's Spirit is dwelling in you. Oh. So it's not something in my brain, it's something in my belly. It's something in my inner man I either have or don't. But you lot are not in the flesh, but rather in the Spirit, assuming God's Spirit is dwelling in you. And I love this. I'm so glad he wrote this. But assuming anyone is not having Christ's Spirit, Paul, why don't you use a demonstrative pronoun there for emphasis? Okay, outos. This one is not his. Think about this. Lots of people, including ministers, proclaim what they don't possess. They claim to be believers, but they're not. Why? Because Christ isn't in them. They're just following some rules or giving credence to some book or whatever. But where the rubber meets the road is not about what we're doing particularly, but about being. And so think about this. Our day is nasty now if we're living by the old nature, if the old nature's in charge. It switches to pleasant present if the new nature is in charge. Now, I was looking for something to tie this together. Romans 7, Romans 8, what Paul said to the Corinthians about the spirit of man knowing the thoughts, etc. And this is what I came up with. And if you don't mind, we have one more text. again, from Paul. We're really giving him a lot of space tonight, but he deserves it. It's in one more letter. We've looked at Romans 7, 8, also Corinthians. Let's look now finally tonight at Colossians 3. This is where it's really well illustrated that you and I can choose the type of day we have. We can choose what our experience of life is on a daily basis. It doesn't have to dictate to us because of what's going on out there. We can actually make a decision and play a part in what our life is like. Colossians chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. Paul has just gotten done telling this church, you know what? You lot need to be kind to each other. You need to be forgiving. You need to be long-suffering. You need to care for one another. And then he finishes with this. Upon or over each and all of tutis, these things, the capstone, if you will, the love, which is meaning the love of God, which is the bond of perfectness. And I love this. I don't know about you guys, but I like practical. I don't just want good news. I want to know how to get involved. I want to know how to make it work. And so does God. He wants us to know how it works. Upon each or over all of these things that he's just listed, being kind, forgiving, long-suffering, etc., the love, which is the bond of perfectness, and here it is, and the peace, the one of God, let it preside in your hearts, into which peace you were called in one body, and be thankful. And again, this is a decision. I was praying the other day, and I was thinking in my office about these wonderful, wonderful men of God that gave us the New Testament, apostles, Christian workers, and I thought, how in the world did they live the lives they've lived? How did they do it? How could they regularly turn the other cheek? I'm not saying they're perfect, they weren't. But still in all, they were miles ahead of the average unsaved person. How in the world did they do it? Did they keep on keeping on? Follow these advices of Paul, for example. How did they do it? How did they keep on keeping on? How did they move house from nasty Nowville to pleasant Presentville? What did they do? And it didn't take me too much longer. I guess you can figure that out. My next question was, how can I do it? I mean, not that I don't do it at all, not that you don't do it at all, but on a more regular basis. How can we do this? How can I do this? And the Spirit of the Lord, I believe I heard the voice of the Spirit of the Lord, and he said two words: turn within. Wow. Turn within. And I thought about some famous, world-famous Christian mystics like Jean Guyon and the Brother Lawrence. He was a Catholic fellow that was a dishwasher. And he was so full of God, and he had so much experience with God that in one of his chapters of his little book, The Practice of the Presence of God, he talked about having to actually cover his face sometimes as he was washing the dishes to contain his jubilance, his overwhelming joy that he had God in here. He had God in his inner man 24/7. Didn't matter what was going on, the clanging of the dishes, the water, the people yelling at him to do it quick or whatever. Didn't matter what was going on out here. Kind of like, I guess, what came to Solomon from whatever venue. God is an optimist. He's positive. He's not negative. I can be an optimist too. Why not? In other words, I've got a choice in this thing. And they all talk about the same thing. Being aware not only of this and what's going on with our natural physical eyes and our natural senses, but what's going on down here. And I love this because this cannot be imitated And it can be ignored, but it needn't be ignored. What's that, Pastor? The concept of peace. Down here, peace. Make that more important than getting the other person told, than being right in that discussion. That of always being the person that gives advice rather than being humble enough to take it, especially when you need it. To live from down here. Paul said, let the peace of God preside. If you look that word up, it literally is used, among other things, of an umpire. And I've mentioned this before, but I think it's a beautiful picture. You think of a baseball game. I don't follow sports much, but I've seen a few baseball games. And I used to get a kick out of it sometimes on television. I would see the owner of the team come down, get right in the arbiter's face. And sometimes they'd be just inches. You could see the spit flying between their faces, And guess what? Didn't matter. When all was said and done, it was the decision of the umpire that was final. And the owner of the team just kind of walk away like this, sit down. And this is why I mentioned this in relationship to Romans. The mind, what we're focusing on, the mind of the Spirit, is life, even peace. That's a good way to check where we are. Are we working our way back to nasty now, or are we on a smooth place toward pleasant present? What's going on down here? And thank God, we don't have a decision about many things in this life, but we have a decision about that. Anytime we want to, we can turn within. We can just become aware, be knowledgeable. Who among men knows the thoughts of a man? We can be aware of the sentence we are about to say, or the letter we're about to write, or that text we're about to fire off. If we take a moment, we can be aware of what's going on up here and then ask ourselves, how's that going to affect this? Am I going to feel peaceful after I shoot that email? Will I have the peace of God ruling in my life like I want it to if I write that letter, if I make that phone call, or not? And this is where I think it's so important. Location, location, location. Where are we living on a regular basis? And the good news is, I think it's fabulous news, we get to choose. We're not predestined to live in the nasty now every day of our lives. We have a choice to leave anytime we want to. God's an optimist. I think I'm going to be an optimist too. The fruit of the Spirit is peace. I'm going to follow peace too. I'm going to be like Father, like Son. And not only will other people, of course, get a benefit, not only will God, our Father, be glorified to see us following in His footsteps, but we'll have a much better life. A much better life. Our blood pressure will go down. Our life will be extended, right? Our sleep will be better. Our conscience will be clear. You name it. We'd probably be here all night talking about what peace, God's peace, can do of a positive nature, not only here, but hereafter too. So I'm throwing this out, and I trust someone's going to catch it, and it'll help somebody. Anybody have a question about this tonight, or input or output or anything like that? Anyone, anywhere? Is it helpful to be able to be reminded of this? I hope so. And like I say, nothing like a life experience like I had with that truck driver. It's enough that he stopped, but I really believe it was God that kind of moved on him to not just stop, but I know you were here first. I know I was going to blast through without stopping at all, but you know what? I'm wrong. This was wrong. Go right ahead. See ya. We're going to come around the Lord's table. I want to mention again, because I forget, and it's not really fair to people that aren't members of our fellowship. If you're watching, listening, and the ministry helps you, again, we are not backed by any organization of any kind, and we're still in a very strange financial situation. Closest it's been in 12 years as a local church. We have been out of debt and doing well for over 12 years. For whatever reason, there's been a confluence of weirdness. We're still very close financially. If you'd like to join with us and help us in some way, there's a way to do it online. Just go to gtm.org, Givelify, PayPal, mail things. Bless their hearts, I've had people stop to deliver little gifts and so on. So if God moves on you to do that, or you'd like to be part of what we're doing, we are reaching out to 209 nations now, all 50 states in the Union. We have nearly 24,000 students that are studying and being prepared for ministry. Lots of good things happening. Just the other day, we had over 1,000 downloads within 24 hours. Doesn't always happen that way, but we did. And I'm just glad that we're able to help people all over the world without personally being there. So I think God's pleased, and we're going to keep doing what we're doing until he tells us to stop.